Today we are going for the same Sale of Goods Act. In this, we are taking into account the transfer of property or ownership. What is this transfer of property or what is this transfer of ownership? When goods are sent or when goods are given from one person to another person, we'll call that thing as transfer of property or transfer of ownership. And this transfer of property or ownership, it is just similar to that of sales. And it is nothing but part and parcel of sales. Okay. There are three stages in transfer of property by a seller. Okay, 3 stages. First one is transfer of property in goods, transfer of position of goods, and passing of risk. These are the 3 stages that we come across when we go for transfer of property or transfer of ownership. Now, the main object of contract of sale is transfer of property in goods from seller to the buyer. Transfer of the property in goods means ownership of goods. Position of goods means the custody or control of goods. So don't be of the opinion that transfer of property of goods and transfer of property and transfer of position of goods. Okay. Position means nothing but the custody or control of the goods. Transfer of ownership is nothing but passing of the goods from seller to the buyer. That is the thing. And when you go for this, automatically you will come across risk, and this risk will be passed from one person to another person. When you come across Sale of Goods Act, compulsory you will come across risk on the part of the seller as well as on the part of the buyer. Okay. So what are the rules that we come across when we go for transfer of ownership or transfer of property? First one is risk of loss. I told you already that you will come across risk of loss. Okay. The risk of loss also passes with the ownership of the goods from the seller to the buyer. See, up to the seller, okay, he will purchase the goods from some other person and he will bring them and he will keep them with him. And it is the responsibility of the seller to look after those goods, whatever he purchased, that there should not be any damage or anything. Okay. So when he is transferring the property or when he is transferring the ownership, risk of loss also it will transfer from one person to another person. In the case of loss or destruction of goods, it is the owner who suffers. Okay, when you come across any loss, or destruction of goods, the owner has to bear. When the goods are with the seller, we can say that he is the owner and he has to bear the risk. Suppose when the goods are given to the buyer, then buyer will become the owner and he has to bear the loss or destruction of goods. If goods are still in the position of the seller and the ownership transferred to the buyer, the loss of goods shall fall on the buyer. Okay. Even though the goods are with the seller, but when the ownership of the goods, when they passes to the buyer, so automatically the buyer will become the owner and he has to bear the loss. Okay, it is not the seller to bear the loss. Okay, let us go for an example for this. B contracts to purchase 30 tons of apple juice from S. Okay, B is the purchaser and S is the seller. But S crushes the apples, put juice in castle box and keeps them ready for delivery. Okay, what he had done is, yes, he had done a good thing. He crushes the apples and he made them juice. and he kept in a castle box. Castle box. And this castle box is ready of apple juice. It is ready for delivery. B, however, delays to take delivery and the juice goes outraged and has to be thrown out. B is liable to pay the price. C, the purchaser, B, he delayed in taking the juice. Okay, he had taken some delay. So B, however, delays to take delivery and the juice goes outraged and has to be thrown out. And has to be thrown out. So B is liable to pay the price because the ownership it passes from S to B. Next, second one is against action against third party. Where the goods are destroyed or damaged by the action of third party, it is the owner only which possesses the ownership in goods can sue or take legal action on the third party. Okay, suppose if you come across a third party, then who is the owner? We have to take into account whether in the previous case, how we will come across in the previous case, whether S is the owner or B is the owner, we have to take. And suppose take for example, okay, A is a third party to the contract. A is a third party to the contract. In that case, okay, B can claim damages from A, that is the third party. So action against the third party is most important. Once again, I'm reading. Where the goods are destroyed or damaged by the action of a third party, it is only the owner who possesses the ownership and goods can sue or take legal action on the third party. Okay. So here B can take a legal action on the third party, that is A. Next, insolvency of the seller or buyer. The next rule is insolvency of the buyer or the seller. In case of insolvency of buyer or seller, it is the question that official receiver can take over the goods depends upon whether the property has passed from the seller to the buyer. So when you go for this, whether the seller he may become insolvent or the buyer he may become insolvent, whatever it may be the case, then the official receiver can take over the goods. Okay, the official receiver can take over the goods and he has to see who is the owner of the goods. Okay, who is the owner of the goods, and according to that, okay, he has to take action, legal action, whether it is the seller or whether it is the buyer. Next, suit for price. The seller can sue for the prices if the goods are become the property of the buyer. Okay, suppose if the ownership it passes from seller to buyer and the buyer has still to pay the price. In that case, okay, in that case, the seller can sue for the price amount that is to be paid to the seller. Like this, you'll come across some rules. What are the rules? Risk of loss. First one is risk of loss. Second one is action against the third party. And third one is insolvency of the seller or buyer and suit for price. These are the four rules that we come across when we go for the transfer of ownership or transfer of property and passing of the property. The rules for ascertaining when the property passes to the buyer are, okay, so there are some rules when the property of good, when the property in goods, when they are passing from seller to buyer, okay, there are some rules to the buyer, to the buyer. And what are the rules? In case of unascertained goods, in a contract of sale, unascertained, no property is transferred to the buyer unless or until the goods are ascertained. Suppose if the goods are of unascertained nature, okay, they should not be given to the buyer unless and until they are ascertained. So the seller has to pass on the property when the goods are ascertained. When they are not ascertained, they should not be passed to the buyer. When they are ascertained, then whatever it may be, the loss that we come across, okay, it has to be borne by the buyer. Second one is, in case of ascertained goods, now up to now we have studied about unascertained goods. Now we are studying about the ascertained goods. When there is a contract for sale of ascertained goods in the property, when they are passed to the buyer at the time when the parties intended it to pass. See, when you are going for this ascertainment, when the ascertainment is going to happen, we have to see that, okay, when the ascertainment is going to happen, that thing we have to take into account. And at the time of delivery, at the time of passing of the property, then only we have to see whether, we have to check whether they are ascertained or unascertained. That's what he is telling. When there is a contract for sale of ascertained goods, the property in them passes to the buyer at the time when the parties intended it to pass. When the seller, when he want to pass the property, okay, then only the ascertainment must be, where they have to see whether the ascertainment was done or not. Next, rules regarding passing the property. What are the rules regarding the passing of property? First one is specified goods. The rules relating to transfer of property in specified goods are passing of property at the time of contract. Okay, what are the rules that we come across when we go for specified goods? Passing of property at the time of contract. When there is an unconditional for the sale of specific goods in a deliverable state, the property passes to the buyer when the contract is made. Okay, when the contract is made, then only the property transfers. Up to that extent, the property won't transfer. The fact is that the time of payment of price or the time of delivery of goods or both is not postponed and does not prevent the passing of property. See, when there is an unconditional for the sale of specific goods in a deliverable state, the property passes to the buyer when the contract is made. There should not be any condition. When there is no condition or when you come across unconditional, okay, passing of property at the time of delivery, okay, the property passes to the buyer when the contract is made. The property, it will go to the buyer. The fact is that the time of payment of price or the time of delivery of goods or both is not postponed. They should not be postponed and does not prevent the passing of property. The passing of property, it will be done, but regarding the payment of price or the time of delivery of goods, they won't be taken into account. Next one is passing of property delayed beyond the date of contract. Suppose they will specify a particular date, and if the passing of property, if it is delayed, then what to do? We have to take into account. There is a contract for the sale of specific goods and the seller is bound to do something to the goods for the purpose of putting them into a deliverable state. The property does not pass until such thing is done and the buyer has notice thereof. Okay, the seller, he has to, suppose if the goods are not ready for delivery, it is the duty of the seller to make the goods ready for delivery. Okay, he must make the goods ready for passing, okay, of property. Okay, until the goods are not in deliverable stage, the property won't passes to the buyer, and the buyer has notice thereof. He has to take, the buyer has to notice whether they are going to be delivered or not. He has to take into account. This rule provides that the property in goods will not pass unless something is done in order to put the goods in a deliverable state. You must keep the goods in a deliverable state. When you are not doing that, automatically the property in goods, it won't pass to the buyer. You won't come across any transfer of property. So these are the two rules that we come across. Okay, regarding specified goods. Coming to unascertained goods. When there is a contract for sale of unascertained goods, the property does not pass to the buyer until they are ascertained. Already I told you. Whatever it may be, unascertained goods that we come across, first of all, they must be ascertained. Then only the property in goods will be passed from seller to the buyer. Until goods are ascertained, there is merely an agreement to sell, but not a sale. Okay, up to what extent you will think, that there is no ascertainment, until then, you won't come across any sale. There seems to be like agreement to sell only. Ascertainment of goods and their unconditional appropriation are the preconditions for transfer of property from the seller to the buyer. First of all, unascertained goods must be ascertained, and there should be an unconditional this thing. There should not be any condition in that. And their unconditional appropriation are the preconditions, first conditions. First of all, the unascertained goods are to be ascertained, and you have to see whether any condition is there or not. These two things are the preconditions for passing of property from seller to buyer. Next, third one is goods sent on approval. This thing you will come across when you go for your final accounts. Okay, goods are sent on approval. See, some people, they will take the goods. Whenever they are good, then only you have to consider that as a sale. Up to that extent, they are of written basis. You must take them as written basis. When goods are delivered to the buyer on approval or written basis, the property passes to the buyer when he signifies his acceptance to the seller and he does any other act adopting the transaction. Until the buyer accepts the goods, up to that extent, the seller, he has to think that they are on written basis. Once if the buyer, when he accepts the goods and when he informs to the seller, then only the seller can treat them as sale. Okay, the passing of property you will come across, but don't be of that opinion that passing of property will be completed. Okay, when you go for goods sent on approval basis. Next, reservation for right of disposal. Okay, reservation for right of disposal. In this context, I'm going to give you one thing. Okay, we are in a pandemic situation, and now previously people, what they're thinking is, we can go and we can take this vaccination like that. But thing is, here after some time, what they did is, you have to reserve and you have to book and you have to reserve, then on a particular specified date, we are going to give the slot or opportunity for you to take the vaccination. So up to that extent, you have to stay. And whenever the reservation date, whenever the date comes, then only you have to think that, oh, okay, that's I am going to take today the vaccination. So reservation for right of disposal. Okay, when you want to dispose, don't be of that opinion that you can dispose at any time. You must reserve that. Okay, people, they must go for reservation. The property and goods, whether specific or subsequently appropriated for the contract, does not pass to the buyer if the seller reserves the right of disposal of goods until the certain goods are until certain conditions are fulfilled. Okay. First of all, you have to reserve, and the seller, he will see that all the conditions, whatever it may be, whether they are fulfilled or not. Up to that extent, you won't come across right of disposal of goods. So this is about this thing. Next, apart from an express reservation of right of disposal, the seller is deemed to reserve the right of disposal when goods are shifted or delivered to a railway for carriage by bill of lading or railway receipt, the deliverable to the order of his agent. So see the peculiarity. Even the right of disposal is not, even though you reserve that, until the seller, until he gets a railway receipt for for carriage of the goods, or bill of lading. Bill of lading. When you want to export that, you must get this bill of lading. So these things, they must get, who the seller must get. Then only you can say that the goods are right for disposal, even though you go for reservation. Even though you go for reservation, whenever you come across this railway receipt or bill of lading, then only we have to consider that the goods are right to disposal to the buyer. When the seller sends a bill of exchange for the price of the goods to the buyer for his acceptance along with bill of lading or railway receipt, the property does not pass to the buyer until he accepts the bills of exchange. Okay, keeping right to deliver disposal is different. Right, keeping the goods right to disposal is different, and this is another thing. Okay, the seller has to receive a bill of exchange for the price of the commodities. Okay, for the price of the commodities, he has to receive the acceptance of the buyer. Okay, along with bill of lading or railway receipt. Then only the goods are set to be passed. Until then, the goods are not set to be passed. Like this, you will come across transfer of ownership or transfer of property. And after this, we are going for another important thing, that is nothing but contracts involving sea routes. Some of the goods are to be sent to other places. So there, people, they will take into account, okay, what are the different ways? What are the different ways? Whether we have to go for landways, railways, airways, or seaways, waterways. Okay, roadways and railways, if you take into account. If it is possible, we can send by road or by railway. If it is not possible, then the other alternatives are airways and waterways. And among these two things, we have to compare which one is cheaper and which one is costlier. Okay, transferring of goods or disposal of goods by airways, it is very costly. People, they know that. So the ultimate thing is, okay, transfer of property in goods by waterways. So we will come across the contracts when we go for sea routes. So with this, I'm closing, and in the next class, we'll go for that. Okay, thank you.